Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Tuesday Raytano. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the discussion that we're hosting today in the margins of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. This is a report launch of our latest report from our North Africa and the Sahel Observatory entitled Conflict, Coping and COVID, Changing Human Smuggling and Trafficking Dynamics in North Africa and the Sahel. This report is a 2-year retrospective looking at the evolution of illicit markets, particularly focused, of course, on the dynamics around the migration of people and the exploitation thereof. It covers the countries of the North Africa and the Sahel, where we have an observatory comprised of over 160 field monitors who are working and embedded in the communities most affected by the growth and rise of nomadic groups, militias, and political and military insecurity. So I'm just going to mute that person. I'm sure many of those of you who are joining us today already know our work. The Global Initiative has been working intensively in North Africa, the Maghreb, the Sahel, for a number of years now, building up a presence that is closely integrated into the most affected communities. We are predominantly funded by the European Union to do daily monitoring of the events and changing dynamics and political control. We also have a number of other projects funded by other donors, which together are bringing out a mapping of different illicit flows and how the political economy controlling them is both changing the direction of movement, changing the way commodities are interacting, and looking at the impact on governance, stability, and the rule of law. We have, I think, of all of the work that the Global Initiative does across its programs, the most granular understanding here of what is happening in this incredibly important region. And we are working at an analytical level to connect that into global events. So with monitors and connections to our work in Europe through the Balkans Observatory and in Western Europe, as well as further afield. This morning, we are going to be hearing from 5 of the GI team who work out of our North Africa and the Sahel Observatory: Mark McAuliffe, its director, Alice Faraday, Matt Herbert, Alex Bish, and Peter Tinty. All of these work in coordination over specific geographic territories within the region we're discussing, coordinating the monitors, building together the information picture, triangulating it and analyzing it within the context of their own expertise. So we're very privileged to have this group. They have an enormous amount of very interesting things to say. And without further ado, I am going to pass over to them. We'll be looking in order at first Northwest and then Southwest Libya, onto Mali, then to Niger and Chad, and then on to Tunisia. We'll probably take around 40 minutes to discuss the evolution and contemporary events, and then we will open up for a series of questions. If you want to help us out, please do put questions into the chat, but up until then, please keep your microphones on mute because we do have a lot of people online. So as a final disclaimer, thank you so much. All the work you're seeing here is, as I said, a combination of evidence and analysis from the GI team and across all of our projects. We are not representing any particular perspective of any donor. The event is being streamed live and it will be recorded. So for all of those of you online, you are being recorded, and then a lightly edited version will be posted for posterity afterwards. So we hope you find everything we have to say interesting. We look forward to your feedback and questions, and I pass over to you, Mark.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your interest in our latest report. We're aware that you represent a very informed audience that is made up in many instances of experts, engaged civil society practitioners, and policymakers. So with this in mind, today the different authors of the report will each give you a very short overview of the key themes, with the idea being to leave space for an engaged Q&A at the end. Before I start, I want to say something about methodology in general. The report is based on a monitoring program which is financed by the EUTF and harnesses, as Tuesday said, our field monitoring system in the field. The views expressed in this report are ours, as underlined by Tuesday, and don't reflect those of the EUTF. The data collection resulted in more than 600 semi-structured qualitative interviews carried out in large part by our monitors on the ground, detailing information and perceptions from smugglers, migrants, community members, security force officials or militiamen, policemen, NGO personnel, and international observers, as well as local observers. This was supplemented by fieldwork carried out by the GI's analysts and authors of the report in territories covered. In 2020, this was very much curtailed due to the travel restrictions related to the pandemic. That said, because we had an established network, the data gathered more than compensated for the distribution caused by the pandemic, and actually enabled us to keep receiving information on some of the most remote territories we cover throughout, essentially. Finally, as part of our methodology, we scan open source data relevant to human smuggling and trafficking, in this case, collected systematically on a weekly basis. And then we use this analyzed information to formulate questions, inquiry areas for field research, and validate the field interviews collected. The key strength of this monitoring method is that it's iterative. So this isn't really a retrospective snapshot per se of the periods between 2019 and 2020, but is rather based on a moving picture that we have developed, refined and corrected month on month during this time. This latest report also builds on a series of research reports that we have been publishing, specifically focused on human smuggling and trafficking, which has been based on this monitoring carried out since 2016. Okay, I'll switch to Libya. I will be speaking about mostly Northwest Libya, and Alice Faraday will be taking on from there and speaking about the south. I think before I delve into the changes monitored in Libya during 2019 and 2020, it's worth drawing a quick outline of the context leading to this period. Claudio, if we could just show quickly the graph, I think it would be helpful. Yes, so if we look at departure data, which we've been collecting since 2016, you will see that from a peak of more than 180 departures in 2016, this dropped to about 126 departures in 2019, and less than 40,000 departures in 2018. Halving to just under 20,000 in 2019, and then climbing to about 40,000 in 2020. 27,000 in 2020. So although there's been an increase between 2019 and 2020, when you view the picture holistically over a few years, what you see essentially is that there's been this massive decline circa 2017 and 2018. I won't go into too much detail because this has been described in detail in the report preceding this one, the Human Conveyor Belt Broken, launched in April 2018. But essentially, the primary takeaway was that this decline was the result of the retreat of militias from the protection of human smuggling. That's not to say that militias are no longer involved in the monetization of migrants in Libya. They are, particularly in respect to detention centers. But by and large, militias have retreated from the more overt involvement in the monetization of movement. which between 2014 and 2016, just to give a couple of examples, saw various armed groups along the west of Libya protect warehouses capable of holding up to 4,000 migrants, for instance, or embarkation points enabling the departure of 25,000 migrants in a single month in May 2016, for instance. That's almost as many migrants as departed in the whole of 2020. Essentially, the protection of militias expanded the capability of smuggling. When this retracted in 2017, we saw a transformation, basically. Gone were the days of these hybrid formations between militias and smugglers, and now we were seeing much smaller outfits of smugglers, primarily working in clandestinity. In fact, what is remarkable about the past 2 years in the Libyan case is that despite the enormous upheaval caused by the advance of the Libyan Arab armed forces with their attack on Tripoli in April 2018, smuggling dynamics on the coast and the number of migrants leaving for Europe remained relatively constant. The reasons for this are multiple. So first, the mobilization and the attack itself created logistical issues for smugglers, temporarily blocking access to coastal areas, interrupting smuggling operations, particularly in departures from the east of Tripoli, for instance, due to the presence of the LAAF in Bani Walid. Smugglers were also, in some cases, able to work around some of these disruptions and various checkpoints set up during the war process. However, it was much more logistically challenging, so this created a drag on operations. Secondly, smuggling networks were still adapting to the evolving scenario. So, as mentioned, from the consortia of militias and smugglers that had characterized the years between 2013 and 2016 or 2017, now that gave way to much more logistically challenging groupings. To the east of Tripoli, for instance, in Al-Homs, in the report, we describe the Hnidi network, for instance, which interacted with the detention center staff in the town where it was based, in Al-Homs, and coastal forces to essentially dominate the town while still maintaining a relatively low profile and creating fundamentally a recycling system where migrants would be placed on boats. They would depart, then they would be intercepted at sea by coastal forces and end up being returned back to land and sold back to this network by local detention center or even coastal force officials, ending up again in the cycle and being exploited and very often ransomed in the process. Lastly, the last element, when the war ended, the Interior Minister Fathi Bashaga, the former Interior Minister Fathi Bashaga, who had effectively taken on the role of war minister during the conflict between April 2019 and April 2020, returned to his reformist agenda. Ever since he was appointed in the late 2018, Fathi Bashaga had put in his crosshairs militias and smuggling networks, predicating really his political future on this campaign of wanting to create a clean slate. When the war ended and Bashaga returned to this agenda with a more pressing outcome, because at that point the political discussion was coalescing around the process that eventually led to the birth of the government of national unity, in which Bashaga unsuccessfully contested. So in this context, that led to the targeting and disruptive law enforcement initiatives, with the notable arrest, for instance, of Abdullah Hnidi, in the second in command of the Hnidi network from Al-Homs, which I've just mentioned, as well as the arrest of UN-sanctioned Coast Guard Captain Abdulrahman Milad al-Bija. On al-Bija's case, I won't dwell too much, because while I'm using it, because this is definitely an example of Fathi Bashaga's agenda put in practice, this was a fraught incident that would require a standalone discussion. Of course, I'm happy to discuss in more detail later on. Why is this extraordinary that the situation remained more or less stable? Because at the time, both the war itself and later COVID created very significant push factors. So the war itself, during the war itself, migrants, both in urban areas, but especially inside detention centers, were often trapped close to or on actual front lines, with armed groups on both sides using them as human shields or targeting facilities where they were being held. The most devastating of these, obviously, was the instance of the bombing of the Tajura detention center by the LAAF on the 2nd of July 2019. 53 people were killed and 150 wounded in a direct hit at the center. COVID exasperated the situation. Claudio, I think we can remove the graph at this point. Thank you. The pandemic exasperated the situation, coming less than a year after the dust had barely settled from the war. A new wave of suffering, essentially, for migrants, for everyone in Libya, really, but migrants were especially badly hit by the pandemic. Many migrants in the initial phase, not only were made redundant from casual work, but also found themselves isolated, unable to leave their homes due to xenophobic attacks associated migrants with a higher risk of them being COVID-19 carriers. Ransoming campaigns, both inside official detention centers as well as traffickers' warehouses, intensified, in part as a result of traffickers, of smugglers being unable or having less opportunity to monetize on migrants. And finally, migrants, particularly in recent months, have been increasingly targeted in rounding up campaigns by official or semi-official law enforcement officials. What this has led, in conjunction with the way the dynamics have been developing, is an exaggeration of the peaks and troughs in departures. So during 2019 and 2020, occasional surges resulted when these smaller clandestine outfits of smugglers concentrated their operations to make launches more profitable. It has always been the case in Western Libya that there's been spurts of departures conforming to good weather windows. However, in the past 12 months, we have been noticing an exaggeration of this trend. This was, for instance, especially the case in August 2020, when more than 4,200 people left Libya, or in November 2020, even more anomalous, given that it was a winter month, with more than 5,000 people departing from Libya, the highest number since departures in 2018. This can in part be explained by the fact that there has been movement of migrants leaving Tripoli to shelter in coastal areas to try and avoid this targeting, where migrants have been rounded up in areas where they live and work, for instance, and in the process, this improving logistics for coastal smugglers. The concern here is that the more exaggerated these peaks, so the more vessels are launched together, the more the likeliness for accidents at sea. I'll conclude very quickly with what's next, basically. With the end of the war in April 2020 and the subsequent establishment of the government of national unity headed by Abdelhamid Beiba, Libya has entered a phase of relative stability, at least insofar as the conflict is concerned. Many of the other underlying problems that Libya has been having have seen no progress whatsoever. The Beiba and his administration have already shown themselves to be more unitary and definitely not pursuing the sort of divisive law enforcement agenda laid out by Bashaga. Examples of this, perhaps the most clamorous, include the release of Abdul Rahman Milad al-Bija. As I said, that's a very fraught incident, but his release essentially sent the message that this is an administration whose priorities are elsewhere and which is willing to accommodate various stakeholders in order to maintain balance, which it sees as critical in tackling the most pressing issues in Libya: the economy, the inflation, electricity provisions, so on and so forth. The business in general is still characterized by these small crews operating in a clandestine manner along the West Coast. What we're seeing and what we've seen in the past 3 months essentially is a further exploitation of pools of migrants desperate to leave Libya in the coastal areas. And in this way, managing operations to maximize departures in short windows of favorable weather. I think I'll stop here and pass it over to Alice, who will be speaking about the South. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'll be speaking about the situation in southern Libya, both in the Fezzan region and the Kufra region. So to understand the smuggling and trafficking dynamics in these areas, we need to look at the evolution of political and security dynamics. And for that, I'm going to go back to early 2019, when the LAF launched a military campaign to extend its control over the Fezzan. The LAF justified this campaign on the grounds that it was the only actor in a position to bring law and order and improved services to the region. And this resonated quite strongly with large parts of the local population. So in the Fezzan, there was already quite an important support base among local population for this campaign. And also among political and community leaders, including armed groups, some of whom had already aligned with the LAF before 2019. And so these dynamics are really key in understanding how smuggling activities are led in 2021. So the LAF's campaign really involved a sort of progressive co-opting of local actors and a reliance on local proxies rather than the coercive deployment of forces from eastern Libya into hostile spaces. And the deployment to Sebha went surprisingly well in January 2019, despite a very diverse political and security fabric and history of communal and political conflict. And this was in large part due to successful dialogue with groups controlling strategic infrastructure in the area. And this included the Tebu population, the main Tebu armed groups in Sebha. But as the LAF moved further south, this dialogue appeared to falter. One of the reasons was that the LAF relied on a very privileged relationship with auxiliary forces composed of Arab tribes that had been in conflict, very violent conflict with Tebu groups in Sebha and Kufra. So this really contributed to the perception by Tebu groups that their community and their interests were being targeted and threatened, directly threatened by the LAF's campaign. So the strategy then to secure the southernmost parts of the Fezzan drastically changed in early February as the LAF attempted to enter Mosul by force. Mosul and the surrounding areas. So there was intense fighting, the use of airstrikes, and this also led to the outbreak of communal conflict between Tebu and Ahali communities in Mosul. But despite the mobilization of these anti-LAF groups among the Tebu community, this resistance was very much short-lived, and it was eventually quelled by the LAF's diplomatic approach to negotiate with Tebu political and security leaders and obtain their nominal alignment with the LAF, whilst allowing them to remain in full control of the areas south of Sebha. So this approach really left room for coexistence between pro-LAF groups and anti-LAF groups, in particular within the Tebu community, whose affiliations with these external forces have always remained secondary to their community solidarity. So the attitude on the ground is therefore one of peaceful coexistence and a strict avoidance of internal conflict. Claudio, perhaps you could show the map of Libya, please. Thank you. So this is true for the areas under control of many Tebu groups, but also in the Tuareg areas, so in Western Fezzan, because the LAF never really physically occupied or controlled the Fezzan in its entirety, but rather it consolidated its position by adopting a sort of franchising model. So with various armed groups pledging allegiance to it, but at the same time retaining a high degree of autonomy in these areas. And this dynamic is really crucial in understanding the lack of any permanent impact on human smuggling of the LAF's campaign. So they never really had an interest in stamping out human smuggling because this would have really antagonized local communities, whereas they preferred a strategy of appeasement. And therefore there was pretty much no pressure on LAF-aligned Tebu groups, for instance, to act against smugglers. And as we moved into 2020, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic didn't really affect smuggling dynamics either, beyond some disruptions at the early stages of the outbreak. So there was a series of raids and interceptions at the end of March 2020, following the announcement that the Libya-Niger border had been closed. But by the summer 2020, the situation had returned to normal and smugglers were able to travel relatively freely from Niger all the way up to Sebha. And generally, checkpoints between the Niger border and Sebha were either not manned or not always manned. They could be easily detoured, or migrants could still pass through in exchange for the payment of a small bribe. And then there's also a significant proportion of migrants who are departing Western Libya for Europe, who travel from the east, so through the Kufra region. And so human smuggling in Eastern Libya does face a lot less scrutiny than the west of the country. But what we see is that in this area, and unlike in the Fezzan, elements of the LAF are directly involved in criminal economies, including in human smuggling. So the main LAF group involved in human smuggling routes via Kufra is Subul Salam. So this is the most powerful armed group in Kufra, and which has played a really important role within the Kufra military zone. And basically, Subul Salam oversees a vast area that stretches all the way to the Sudanese and Chadian borders. And although they've reported arrests and interceptions in this area, there's also been really consistent reports that they have in fact been overseeing smuggling routes themselves in cooperation with the Sudanese Rapid Support Forces further south. And basically the arrangement allows convoys to pass through checkpoints in exchange for paying a tax, which is quite usual. And Subul Salam has managed to gain a monopoly over the smuggling business in the area. They effectively pushed out the Tebu prior to 2018, and they created quite a homogeneous and stable framework, which resulted in better security for migrant convoys and less risk and visibility for these operations. And finally, Subul Salam has also been involved in other illicit activities. So there have been quite a few situations that indicate that it partners with high-ranking affiliates within the LAF to support drug trafficking or cigarette trafficking across the area. So either through joint ownership of shipments or by providing protection for these shipments traveling through the region. So what we've seen is that while arrangements made in the Fezzan and southern Cyrenaica, Kufra region are quite different, they both allow a relatively smooth running of smuggling activities, either tolerated or allowed by the LAF or directly facilitated by it. So that's basically the situation today and over the last 2 years in the south. And I will now pass over to my colleague Alex. Thank you, Claudio.
Peter, do you want to go first or shall I go? Okay, I'll go for it. I've got a PowerPoint, so let me just try to play it now. Can everybody see it? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm assuming that's a yes. So essentially, I'll be presenting the dynamics in Niger and Chad. I've only got a few minutes per country, so I'm going to fly through them. If you want any details, you're going to have to read the report. But to summarize, essentially over the past 5 years, the human smuggling ecosystem in Niger went through 3 main phases. The first is a phase of disruption in 2016, 2018, basically driven by a law enforcement drive locally. And then from 2018 to 2020, we saw a relaxation of this law enforcement campaign. And since COVID, we've seen another phase of disruption and then adaptation. So I'm going to go through these 3 phases quickly. The initial phase of disruption was basically driven by the enforcement of an anti-smuggling law. In mid-2016, hundreds of smugglers were arrested, hundreds of vehicles were confiscated. We've looked at these dynamics in our previous report, the human conveyor belt broken, but essentially the effect on that was a reduction of migrant smuggling flows. So from Agadez, 350 a day in 2016 down to 20 a day. Now these are recorded migrant flows. What essentially happened was that an industry that was very open, the migrant smuggling industry in Agadez was the epicenter of it in West Africa, went clandestine. And so smugglers adapted their methods, they adopted more remote routes, and in cases of breakdowns, migrants died. And so we saw a drastic increase in 2017 of migrant deaths, and those recorded migrant deaths are then lowered in the next few years. So essentially, after that intense period of law enforcement in 2016, mid-2016 and 2017, what we saw was a gradual relaxation of that campaign. And this was reported widely by smugglers that we've interviewed. And so a gradual increase in the transportation of foreign migrants using clandestine methods, both to Libya and Algeria, was seen. One key dynamic in particular was the reorganization of the weekly convoy that left Agadez, and which was now mostly transporting Nigerians. So a trade union organizes it in coordination with the local police force. They submit a registry. The drivers have to register. There are 200 drivers registered. And essentially, the process is not perfect, so to say, in that there are ways in which smugglers have managed to use it to transport foreign migrants as well. But this is essentially how many, let's say, former smugglers have managed to cope with their business being cut down, essentially. Since early 2020 and essentially late March 2020, that slow recovery of the business was essentially disrupted again with the travel restrictions that were put in place to disrupt, to stop the spread of the virus. Essentially, the effect was that it reduced the migrant pool in the country. There were fewer migrants to smuggle, and so also within the country, travel restrictions were put into place. Notably, on the passenger allowance for local smugglers was reduced to 10 passengers per vehicle. Lots of smugglers who had reconverted into that business of transported Nigerians didn't deem it worthwhile in terms of profit to carry 10 passengers per vehicle, essentially adopted more remote routes once more. So you've got that transportation which had been Nigerians, which went underground once more, and it led to migrant deaths in the few months after the implementation of these restrictions. We've released free, but there'll most likely many more. Of course, once more, similarly to what happened after 2016, many smugglers had to find other activities to cope with the reduced business. And one of those was the gold. So this is the Jado goldfield. This is one of the sites on the goldfield. The Jado goldfield had already been used after 2016 by many smugglers to cope. And so essentially what happens is that they invest in gold mining, or they invest in, they smuggle fuel, for instance, subsidized fuel from Libya down to the goldfields, or goods and or water. And essentially, this is a goldfield which was closed down in February 2017, or late February 2017, because of security issues. Officially, at the time, there were around 30 to 40,000 miners. Today, during the fieldwork that we did actually in May 2020, our estimate is 6,000 miners. So a lot less migrant workers, but a key source to cope with lost business. By the way, these gold sites essentially make up the size of London. So just to give you an idea of how big these goldfields are. Another coping mechanism that we've witnessed was in the wildlife trade. This is a chimpanzee being smuggled across the desert. This often happens in winter months. On the back of the vehicle, we've got great African parrots. The consumption market is in Libya. Many smugglers have also moved to the drug trade, and we've got a report coming out in a few months on this, which will detail these dynamics. A key dynamic that we've noticed was the consolidation of some other human smuggling hubs during the period of interest, and further during COVID. I won't go into all of them, but I'll just look briefly at the one on the border between Benin and Niger, because it was quite interesting to see that because of the closure of the border during COVID, many of the local migrants, the demand increased to cross the border, and essentially the fishermen locally, and also previously some smugglers who've been operating for years, really invested in motorizing the pirogues, the little boats, to face the growing demand, and this is of course once the borders reopen in West Africa, this is an area that we will watch to see how the smuggling economy will evolve, and the pool of international migrants increases. So to conclude, for Niger, some key trends to watch. Of course, we believe that if the migrant pool doesn't increase, smugglers are going to continue to look for other coping mechanisms in other illicit economies. Then these new smuggling hubs that I mentioned will continue to consolidate, and we'll be monitoring how this has an impact also on the safety of migrants in the coming months. And finally, and this is really linked to Chad, the insecurity that we've been witnessing north of Agadez in the desert, and which is starting where we're really seeing an impact on the safety of migrants, is likely to grow, and is quite worrying. So without further ado, on to Chad, which of course it has been an increasingly interesting country in recent months with the fall of Idriss Déby, the president. Similarly, 3 phases, very different phases though. The first was the growth of human smuggling in the country, very tied to the gold economy from earlier than 2016, but really in the past 5 years, up until 2018, the discovery of gold in the north really fueled human smuggling networks across the country. The second phase is a phase of disruption with the intensification of the government's war on illicit gold mining in the north, and through since late 2019 and through 2020, what we saw was a steady recovery with the end of that war and the return of arms to gold mines, and they've invested heavily in the gold economy. So essentially, the most active routes in the country start from the east, from Abéché, from Guinée, and go all the way northwards to the northwestern Tibesti region of the region of Tibesti, which has a lot of gold fields. Most of the migrants being transported on these routes are from the Darfur or Chad, to a less extent Eritrea and Ethiopia, but really there are very few. Most of the migrants are Chadian and Darfuri. The flows are fairly low comparatively to other countries. But what happens on these gold fields? Essentially, migrants come, work, will either return to their communities once they've earned enough money, or continue further to Libya, or even sometimes directly to Europe. These gold sites, one of the most famous gold field is called the Kouribougoudi gold field. It's twice the size of London, a really vast area, very remote gold sites, which leaves migrant workers very vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation, slavery, and it's a very dangerous area. There have been many incidents of insecurity, often between armed groups, underlined along ethnic lines, and the goldfields have really acted also because of their geographical location as key hubs for drugs, arms, and car smuggling across the region. Now, a simple response would be to close them down. It's worth noting that the Sahelian gold economy has been a key coping mechanism for otherwise impoverished communities in the region. So regulating them is probably the best forward. How is another question. That phase of growth was quickly followed by a phase of disruption, mainly led by N'Djamena's war on illicit gold mining. The goal of this war was essentially to begin exploiting the gold in an industrial manner. So controlling the gold fields and being able to create industrial gold extraction and create revenue, generate revenue for the state. Now, N'Djamena failed this war. There were many reasons why. Briefly, budgetary constraints. It's very difficult to wage a war in such difficult terrain, thousands of kilometers away from the capital. And also because of local armed group opposition, they managed to get a peace deal, which was then annulled later on in March 2020. But essentially, following the peace agreements, which was reached in November 2019, there was a steady recovery of the human smuggling networks operating in the country. And what we saw during COVID was that actually the government restrictions meant to stop travel had close to no effect on the most active smuggling routes. That's because they were already remote. The practice was in some cases already underground. Actually, during the same period, what we saw was an intensification of the routes. And this was mainly due in our assessment to the return of Chadian and Sudanese armed groups from the war on Tripoli and the war in Libya in the north down to southern Libya. And they gradually invested back in these gold fields, notably the Kouribougoudi gold field, in turn fueling human smuggling activity from their communities, which are often in eastern Chad. So, to conclude, the key trends to watch are this return of armed groups to goldfields, and this has been exemplified by the incursion made by the FACT rebel group, which indirectly led to the death of Idriss Déby and created a massive challenge for the government. Another key trend to watch is, of course, the stability of this new government in Chad, and the security situation locally will affect the importance that Chad has as a transit country. And why should we care about this? Well, the security of migrants transiting the country will be considerably affected. The migrants that we have spoken to who have transited northern Chad were often in very precarious conditions. And that's it from me. I'll pass the torch on to Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex. So for my presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about the migrant smuggling networks that are operating out of Mali, particularly out of the northern city of Timbuktu. To begin with, I'll just note that Mali's role as and status as a key transit hub for migration in the region is owed largely due to its political geography. And that is, Mali is a member of the Economic Community of West African States, otherwise known as ECOWAS, which means that the vast majority of migrants transiting through Mali do not need a visa in order to enter Mali. So Mali's status as or role as a transit country is due largely to the fact that anyone who wants to travel to Algeria in particular irregularly can travel all the way to Mali just by using public transportation or various private transportation or even flying to Mali. Prior to the COVID pandemic, there were two principal routes that migrants, or two principal hubs really, that through which migrants would pass en route to Algeria. The first was the city of Gao, which is the largest city in northern Mali, and the second is Timbuktu, which is the second largest city in northern Mali. In both cases, migrants, as I said before, would pretty much just take readily available public transportation to reach both cities. And then upon arriving in either city, would then link up with transporters who served as smugglers. One crucial component of these routes, however, is the fact that Malian nationals do not need a visa in order to travel to Algeria. So as a result, many of these transportation modalities were in fact consisted of migrants joining the same transportation networks and flows of regular Malian migrants who were entering into Algeria in a legal, regular fashion. The actual crime of migrant smuggling really only took place at the Algerian border in cases where non-Malian nationals would either cross into Algeria irregularly, either through bypassing formal checkpoints or through bribes at various border controls, or because of the fact that Malians can travel into Algeria legally without and visa-free, there's a natural black market for Malian documents, fake and fraudulent Malian documents that non-Malian nationals will try to procure within Mali. Prior to 2019, there had been some cases of non-West African nationals, non-ECOWAS nationals transiting through Mali towards Algeria, notably Syrian nationals and nationals from Bangladesh. But those flows, for lack of a better way to put it, have pretty much stopped taking place. There's still examples occasionally in which we hear from key informants on the ground that there are non-Sub-Saharan African nationals passing through Gao or Timbuktu, but these appear to be very isolated cases and aren't really evidence of a sustained flow or network moving non-African nationals through Mali. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were border closures in which Mali then set, all of its borders were closed with even its ECOWAS neighbors, and crucially the Algerian border. This had the effect of pretty much shutting down migrant smuggling in Mali completely. The key component of this was the fact that migrants were no longer traveling to Mali in search of migrant smuggler services in Gao or Timbuktu. The borders did begin to soften in the summer of 2020. However, the reopening of ECOWAS borders was delayed because of a coup in the capital city of Bamako in August, which led to the ECOWAS decision to maintain border closures in response to the coup. Those have since been reopened. There's also been a softening of the Algerian border, and some would say just a complete opening according to contacts along that southern border, which has reinvigorated these migrant smuggling networks. So migrant smuggling networks operating out of Timbuktu have completely rebounded to the pre-pandemic status quo. There's widely available subsidized fuel from Algeria, which has brought prices back down to the pre-pandemic status quo. Shortly after, just as the border was opening, prices to travel from Timbuktu to Algeria irregularly were more than double the pre-pandemic prices, but now they have returned to the pre-pandemic status quo, which is about 230 to 300 euro per passenger. The main route along this route is from Timbuktu to the northern town or location of Ina Farik, which is near the border crossing in Algeria with Inkalil. Interestingly, though, the migrant smuggling networks operating out of Gao have not recovered, and there's several reasons for this. The main one is insecurity, and these are dynamics we had seen taking place even before the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent border closures. So Gao is increasingly isolated due to security constraints. The central Mali is as insecure as ever, so there has been a disruption of transport links linking southern Mali to Gao. Similarly, ongoing insecurity in the tri-border area with Niger and Burkina Faso. This is a tri-border area known as the Liptako Gourma. The security situation has completely deteriorated, which has led to very large disruptions between in transport links that migrants would otherwise take to access Gao. These same disruptions aren't as prevalent for transportation networks linking Bamako to Timbuktu. There are ways to pass through, to bypass central Mali and to go through areas that, while there's still instability and insecurity, one can travel with much more predictability. And thus, this is why Timbuktu has been able to rebound as a key migrant smuggling hub in northern Mali. As recently as our last reporting period, which was in April, our monitors in Timbuktu were indicating that as many as 500 migrants were passing through Timbuktu heading towards Algeria per week, which is a very large number, although we should specify that it's not always clear what percentage of these people being transported from Timbuktu to the Algerian border are Malian nationals, and particularly Malian nationals from southern Mali. The last point I'll touch upon here is that there has been a relatively recent dynamic in which Malians, particularly from the Kai region, are seeking these services of smugglers based in Mauritania in order to board boats, in order to go to access the Canary Islands. This is a fairly new development, a recent development within the last year. It's a separate dynamic from those that are heading towards Algeria, but we have some pretty strong indications that the actors operating in Mauritania who are arranging these boat departures from areas north of Nouakchott and south of Nouadhibou are Malian nationals who are working in coordination with Mauritanian nationals. And this is something we're monitoring, and I'm happy to elaborate further on that dynamic. And we should have actually a report coming out in the coming weeks that focuses specifically on the migrant smuggling networks that are facilitating irregular migration from Senegal, Mauritania, and Morocco to the Spanish Canary Islands. And with that, I will pass it on to, I believe Matt Herbert will be speaking next.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I'm going to be touching base on Tunisia, and I'll try to go relatively rapidly in order to allow at least a little bit of time for question and answer at the end of this. So there are 4 key points that I think are particularly salient to Tunisia in 2020 and remain salient to Tunisia right now. The first of which is that over the course of the last 12 months, we've seen a irregular migration surge out of the country. And there's not anything that's been at this level since the months immediately after the revolution in 2011. So it's been almost a decade since migration has been this high. Over the course of 2020, the Tunisian security and defense forces and those of Italy intercepted 26,488 irregular migrants that left from Tunisia. This is compared to about 7,500 in 2019, so a substantial rise. And the expectation is amongst those that we talk to, irregular migrants on the ground, as well as others, that in fact, this comprises only a part of the total flow, that a substantial portion of departees from Tunisia actually arrived undetected in either Lampedusa, Pantelleria, or Sicily. Now, in terms of the geography of Tunisian irregular migration from Tunisia, there are departures all along the Tunisian coast, from the north around Bizerte, heading over to Sicily, to the Nabil area, the Capel Peninsula, heading to Pantelleria, to the south and center of the country, where many of the migrants departing head on to Lampedusa. What we've seen so far over the course of the first few months of this year, the first 5 months of this year, is really a continuing intensification of this trend. So to date, the Tunisian security and defense forces, along with those of Italy, have intercepted about 5,600 irregular migrants. So this is substantially higher than what we saw at this period last year. And this points to the continued salience of migration drivers and the continuing pressures to depart by some Tunisian youth and those that are not so young. Now, this brings me on to the second key point, which is that who is departing from Tunisia has shifted substantially from years past. Historically, migrants leaving from the Tunisian coast have been Tunisian, male, and young. Over the course of the last 24 months, this has changed to encompass women, elderly individuals, complete family units, as well as children. Now, there's also been a sharp increase in foreign migrants that are leaving from Tunisia. In 2018, for example, they composed 8% of all of those intercepted by Tunisian security and defense forces. If you look to last year, it was about 23%, or 2,722 foreign irregular migrants. Again, what we've seen to date this year suggests that there's an acceleration of this trend. So far through to yesterday, about 1,500 foreign migrants have been intercepted by Tunisian security and defense forces. So this seems to be a growing issue. I do want to stress that the rise in foreign irregular migration through Tunisia does not appear to be connected to dynamics in Libya. It's not a matter of displacement, though there is some displacement actually from the West, from Algeria, where dynamics linked to COVID led to a number of irregular migrants that were living in northern cities in that country to move into Tunisia initially to find work, but then likely later to attempt to embark for Italy. Now, I'd like to then move on to my third point, which is the declining salience of human smugglers in all of this. So human smuggling networks have operated along the Tunisian littoral for the last 30 years. Many of them are very small, 3 to 5 individuals, and they operate in a really hyper-local fashion. So there aren't the big smuggling networks that you find in Libya. They continue to be used by Tunisians, and especially by foreign irregular migrants leaving from Tunisia. But their salience is declining, and there are 2 reasons for this. One is linked to safety. Tunisian irregular human smuggling networks, though they've had a better safety record than what you find in Italy, nonetheless have become known for violating the safety and the rights of migrants. For example, there have been rumors of smugglers throwing some off boats. And also there's been an issue with human smugglers being much more easily interdicted by Tunisian security and defense forces than the other form of departures that we see. Now, that other form of departures is self-smuggling, where largely young groups of Tunisians come together and they buy boats, they buy engines, and they buy GPS units, and they depart autonomously. This is much more difficult for security forces to identify in advance, and it's seen as much safer by the Tunisians involved. And so this points to the real challenge that is faced by the Tunisian government and foreign partners as they attempt to respond to irregular migration issues with a securitized approach. Simply, the salience of that, the impact is declining substantially. The fourth point, and I'll be quick here, is what we've seen around COVID-19 is not so much that it's driven new push factors for irregular migration, as much as it's exacerbated already existing economic and social conditions. Tunisia already had a weakened economy, which COVID-19 lockdowns and business restrictions have further impacted, leading to mass unemployment and underemployment. The sense of social marginalization felt by many Tunisians, the frustration with the government non-delivery of services has similarly been heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we see is that this is likely to have a particularly long tail. The economic losses amongst base of the pyramid populations are not likely to be recouped soon. And at a social level, the concept of migration as a mass movement has increased. And practically, for those migrants that have departed and been intercepted, the process of migration has been demystified. And so it's much more likely that they'll attempt to migrate further in the future. I'll turn it over to Tuesday for questions, and I'd be happy to answer more on Tunisia going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all my colleagues for their inputs and their presentations. Those were excellent and very informative. As I did mention, we are taking questions in the chat. There have been a couple which have already been answered, particularly around the methodology of our research and work. In the meantime, I'm just going to kick off with one question that we got actually in advance of the meeting. Somebody wrote in asking whether the reopening of borders across the countries on the central Mediterranean route is likely to have a major impact on migration patterns. And one question following on from that is whether or not we could expect an increase in migrant arrivals when African border restrictions eases. Mark, can I turn that question to you to kick off while we process the ones that have come in since?
Thank you. So if we look at the picture in general, and we look at Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya, since we're talking about departures, the migratory routes, irregular migratory routes feeding these three countries have been extremely diverse. So the changes that have been taking place with the lifting of restrictions in the central Sahel, I wouldn't say will necessarily have a very direct impact. As Matt has been saying, the migratory flows from Tunisia have been very much driven by Tunisians. There's been a lot of sub-Saharan African nationals as well, but there's been also a lot of Tunisians. There's a similar situation in Morocco, where a significant flow of migrants that had developed towards Morocco about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, has now dissipated due to changes that have been taking place as a result of measures by the Moroccan government. And in Libya, as discussed, if you take the overall findings we've presented, both for the north and the south, what you find essentially is that although there's been a reduced but relatively steady movement of migrants through the south, it's the coastal dynamics that have really been making a difference in the number of departures. So, to cut a long story short, the trend for the current trend looking forward indicates to us that there is going to be that we should expect an increase in the number of migrants departing from the North African coast in general. I don't anticipate that this is going to be the result of the lifting of restrictions and borders in Central Sahara, at least not for the time being. Perhaps further down the line, that will have an impact.
Thanks, Mark, very much. Another question that came through actually was looking at other forms of the illicit economy. So the impact of border closures and other political and security dynamics on the trafficking of drugs, for example, cocaine, tramadol in Niger, and some of the West African coast dynamics. Alex, do you think we could pass that one to you, please?
Sure. So what was the question exactly? How the
other illicit economy dynamics. So looking specifically at the trafficking of drugs and recent seizures, both in the Sahel and in West Africa along the littoral.
One of the key dynamics that we've monitored in northern Niger during the COVID period, with the decreased footfall, so essentially less migrants going through during the COVID period, was an increase actually in drug trafficking and of high value drug trafficking. And parallel to that increase was an increase in the number of armed groups trying to capture, so preying upon these drug traffickers to capture the high value commodities that they're transporting and then sell them on to the other brokers in Libya. And why is that the case? Well, drug traffickers usually have a very different modus operandi. They use different vehicles, usually very brand new Toyota Tundras. They do not want to meet anyone on their way. They're going very quickly, brand new vehicles, will not stop, change drivers. And so the opportunity that's presented with less people on their way is something that they clearly took advantage of. I think that generally that the increase in cocaine production in the last few years, and also perhaps of hashish in some areas may have also stimulated these flows. But this is something that we will discuss in greater depth in an upcoming report that we've written with Alice Faraday. So you'll have plenty of information about that.
Thank you, Alex. One of the big trends, I think, of the last year was the very large drug seizures that happened along the North African coast also. Matt, can I ask you to perhaps speak to the issue of drug trafficking briefly?
Absolutely. So I think there are a couple key trends to highlight there, and this builds a little bit on Alex's point. First, one of the things that we saw with the border closures around COVID-19 was a substantial impact on the informal and illicit economies that occur across borders in North Africa. So quite simply, on public health grounds, the governments of Tunisia, Algeria, and to a degree Morocco, clamped down on cross-border movement in a way that we haven't seen to date. And what this led to was a crisis within the illicit economy. And specifically a crisis concentrated amongst those that are involved in small-scale commodity smuggling. So fuel, food, all of that. Many were tossed out of work. Those that could find work, and this feeds into Alex's point, were rediverted into the harder forms of criminality as exemplified by cross-border movement of drugs, to a degree of tobacco. All these goods that are higher value and where the trafficking networks can put in place the sort of substantial efforts and investment to subvert state border security efforts. And so this, again, is something that's likely to have a much longer tail within North Africa. Once individuals go into these groups, once these routes are established, it becomes much more difficult to fully address them. And so it's something that we're going to continue to be tracking quite closely, specifically around the issue of hashish, but also cocaine going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. Appreciate it. There are two questions around southern Libya and the impacts along the border areas, Alice. So if I could bring you back up. One question we've had is around, first of all, the instability post the death of Déby in Chad, and whether that's having impact on the tribal dynamics and other cross-border issues for southern Libya, and also how we're seeing the impact of COVID on migrant safety in Niger. And some of our other colleagues commented on the dynamics in the countries which they focused on. So Alice, could I ask you?
Yeah, sure. So for the first question, in terms of the situation in northern Chad and the impact of, so first of all, from early April, there was obviously the offensive by the FACT that entered northern Chad and descended as far as the Kanem region. And this resulted in quite intense fighting with the Chadian army that ended up, the circumstances are quite unclear for now, but resulted in the death of President Deby. So obviously this is a major development for the region, for Chad, for Niger, Sudan and Libya. The question around the impact of these dynamics on southern Libya has been quite prominent. I know that many people in southern Libya have been quite worried about the possibility of conflict in Chad, and in particular in northern Chad, resulting in the displacement of parts of the population of northern Chad to southern Libya, and also in terms of some sort of spillover of instability. So far, that hasn't been the case. There hasn't really been any major clashes in northern Chad. The main confrontation happened in the Kanem region, and that's more or less over now. In fact, it is over now. In southern Libya, although obviously the groups that launched the offensive and some other incursions in northern Chad in April were based in southern Libya, their arrival in Chad didn't really affect the dynamics in southern Libya. Overall, I mean, we could go into the technicalities of the different communities that were involved, but I think basically what's important to bear in mind is that the communities from which the FACT rebel group are from are not the same Tebu communities as those that are present in northern Chad and in southern Libya, which is the Teda Tebu community. So there's not necessarily a sort of very direct support for the FACT, for instance, among the population, the Tebu population of northern Chad and southern Libya. So overall, most of the Tebu actors in southern Libya have chosen to remain sort of neutral in the situation. They haven't aided the FACT, they haven't stopped the FACT, and that's allowed for a relative continuity in the dynamics in southern Libya so far. The second question about the safety of migrants, yeah, I think that's really quite important, because basically with the implementation of COVID-19 restrictions in Niger, as Alex said, obviously there were less migrants arriving in Niger for travel onto Libya or Algeria, but those who did arrive were forced to use much more remote routes through the country. Basically, in Niger, there's always been a difference between the foreign migrants and the migrants, local people from mostly the southern areas of Niger, who were tolerated. Their transport was tolerated towards Niger. But what happened with the COVID-19 situation is that even the transport of Nigerian migrants became clandestine. So basically, all the people traveling through were forced to use routes and passeurs who were using these routes that are far more remote, and using areas that often coincide with those that are used by drug trafficking, and in particular armed bandit groups. And so in the last few months, actually, there have been several occasions where migrants have been kidnapped for ransom by armed bandit groups. And actually in December, a group of Pakistani migrants were kidnapped in Niger. And so I think that's quite an important development, because we are seeing a very significant risk posed to migrants because of the restrictions on their travel.
Thanks, Alice. I'm afraid I'm not letting you escape yet, because there's a question that's come in on the chat. asking whether or not we're expecting, or whether you're seeing through the analysis of the field monitors, an increase in Ethiopian or Tigray migrants from Sudan through to Libya, especially through Kufra, because of the situation in Ethiopia. I don't know if you're able to comment on that one, or if you want to pass it on to somebody else.
I'm not sure that for now that's something that is a visible development in southern Libya, although we are looking into this because we do know that actually we had some reports of a route used by Ethiopian and Eritrean migrants that instead of going through Egypt, they are potentially traveling via actually Sebha. So that's something that we'd be looking at. But I think that's something that would probably be best discussed further down the line once we have more clarity.
Thanks, Alice, very much appreciated. We're more or less out of time, so I'm going to turn back to Mark and ask you, there have been a couple of questions around methodology, and in particular on whether or not we're seeing women as perpetrators or actors, I guess, in the illicit economies in the region. Maybe if you wouldn't mind closing us off with a little bit of an explanation about how the observatory is functioning, the kind of data we're collecting, and what we can expect to see in the future, and then wish everybody a great rest of the day. Mark, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we're conducting a study currently that's looking also specifically at the role of women in illicit economies around border areas. We're currently collecting data, so I expect that we should have something towards the end of this year. It's a very challenging research area. Not only because both illicit economies in the regions we're talking about, but also border areas are very much dominated by men. This is not to say that women do not play a part, but that there's an added layer of difficulty in establishing these patterns and trying to generate insight. This is also where iterative monitoring helps in this situation, because again, you're not taking a snapshot of a situation frozen in time, but you're pursuing a research question over a span of several months, embedded with the community, researching among monitors who are essentially part of the community. In general, I would say the monitoring network has been an expansion over the past couple of years. In 2016, we were operating with a network of about 25 to 30 people, concentrated mostly in Libya and Niger, and that has now expanded to 160. We're currently concentrated on consolidating this effort, systematizing further our data collection, and integrating as much as we can different monitors in various parts of the network. We look forward to an eventual further expansion. It's been a very gratifying process over the past couple of years, seeing us develop the network in this way. Thank you, Mark.
And on that note, I will recommend to you all again to please check out our website, www.globalinitiative.net, for the report that we launched today, as well as all of the other products from the North Africa and Sahel Observatory. Of course, please do get engaged with the work of the Global Initiative. We are spanning both thematic and geographic and different illicit economies. Join our mailing list, check us out on social media. We really do want to make sure that dissemination and exchange is a priority of the work that we're doing, and that we're ensuring that there is a consolidated and focused policy discussion around these very important topics. Thank you to all my colleagues on the panel for sharing with us today. Thank you for everybody who joined us, and we look forward to seeing you at another event soon. We have 3 more presentations coming out within the margins of the CCPCJ. You can see those dates and times on our website.